Hello everyone, my name's Andrew Ward from Regen Farmers Mutual. Today I'm joined in conversation with Josh Gilbert. Josh is a proud Worrimi man and comes from up near Gloucester Way. G'day Josh, how are you doing?
I'm well, thanks mate. How are you?
Very well. Josh, for those that don't know you, I'm just going to share screen and we'll go through this process that we do with all of our speakers. I just ask them to introduce themselves, if that's all right. If for somebody who hasn't met you, could you give us your background?
Yeah, so I mean, essentially, I'm a Worrimi Indigenous man from mid-north coast of New South Wales. Indigenous on both my mum and dad's side, whose families both have connections to this land that we call Gloucester now. Recorded here in 1825 to 1835, when AACO first got given their million-acre land grant and started connecting with what I call modern agriculture, or what we call within agriculture as traditional agriculture now. So history from there. Grew up in a place called Worrimi down near Gabby Chan, who was your last host, just about half an hour from her. And grew up down there. My mum's a school teacher, my dad was a mechanic, and spent most of my childhood down there. Spent a bit of time in Batlow for a bit, and then moved up back onto country up home here. I guess have always had a connection to agriculture, though probably ignored it most of my life so far. So I think up until my late teens, I was wanting to pursue a career in law, and studied law at University of Newcastle. Got most of the way through my degree, and then dropped out to try and look at the agricultural world a bit more. So it was, I guess, a really clear decision for me in my late teens that I wanted to be involved in the agricultural sector somehow and in some way. So I do that in a few ways at the moment. We have Bradford cattle and Clydesdale horses, and my grandmother has a sheep property still down in Worrimi, which I try and get to as much as I can. I also try and work within the ag and youth in ag space up in our local area. So I'm involved in Wing and Beef Week up here, and also in an agricultural field day for Clydesdale horses and other heavy horses in this area. And, the local show movement and things like that. And then on the other side, try and do policy work, and I'm studying in Indigenous Agriculture at Charles Sturt University. So doing higher degree research there, and really focusing on Indigenous involvement within Western agriculture post-colonisation.
So that's going to be a ripe area for us to investigate, because I know we met through your involvement with PwC. So you've also had this pretty illustrious corporate career as well. Do you mind if before we move into the Indigenous Ag, get you to, maybe share with viewers how a boy from, Worrimi Gloucester, how do you end up in a shiny tower doing agriculture in the city? Tell us that story.
Mate, I'm not even sure, to be honest, but effectively, as I said, I went to university. I had to do a dual degree, so I did commerce and law. Got 90-ish% through my law degree, and ended up dropping out. I was working at the ABC during those times as well. I had a cadetship with them, so I got to have the hands-on experience there, and just realized that one weekend actually that I just wanted to be involved in that ag sector more, and I wanted to do more time and spend more time in that space. So dropped out of uni, left my job at the ABC, and went and worked at an accounting firm in Wagga, just a small little practice, doing people's books, their BAS returns, and financial statements and things like that. And to be honest, probably wasn't enjoying it as much as I hoped I would, and got this really, was involved in young farmers and a range of different agricultural programs at the time, and through that met some people on Twitter who were then very, very nice to me and reached out and said, hey, we're just starting work at PwC's Indigenous Consulting. Would you be keen on coming over? And I guess from there, just met these people in real life, face to face, and took the jump to go and join PIC at PwC, and found myself in Canberra and Sydney, but also right across the country, working with Indigenous mob, making sure that their voices were incorporated into policy for government and within the corporate sector as well.
Can I just confirm PIC is PwC Indigenous Consulting? Yeah. And the sorts of groups that you would typically work with, you said mobs from around Australia, but were they mobs or the land title officers, or like how's the engagement? Yeah.
It was really diverse depending on the project. So everything from Indigenous businesses, working with them on cash flow management and business planning, to going out to community halls and just sitting down and meeting with mob and yarning about bush food industries or policy, to being even in Sydney and meeting with mob located there, talking about strategies and corporate policies about their organizations as well. So it was really this kind of massive suite of what I think is probably becoming more Indigenous affairs now, this broadening of Indigenous insights and Indigenous businesses and policies and governments as well, that's really forging new ground, I think, in Australia.
Yeah. Well, that's a great departure point for us. So in your time, what have you seen as some of the progression around policy? So I'll give you a context for this. Years ago, there was no discussion of Indigenous agriculture, and we kind of didn't have it in our minds that pre-European occupation, of course, Indigenous civilization supported themselves, but we didn't think of that as agriculture. Now, Bruce Pascoe and Yankapora, you've got a lot more people understanding the value of Indigenous wisdom, Indigenous agriculture, Indigenous landscape management. Have you seen this evolving in your time, or does it predate your time? How do you feel about this awakening, and where are we at in terms of the progression of an awakening?
Yeah, so I think it's important to kind of stage this, and why I think that's important is because I think a lot of the literature and a lot of the conversation that we have in Australia is really pre-colonization. There seems to be this real push across the literal landscape, but also within strategy, whether that's government strategy or corporate strategy, on what is deemed as Indigenous agriculture. And I use that term quite broadly to mean the pre-colonial aspects of agriculture that sustain Indigenous populations, and whether people want to use that term as accepting that there was Indigenous agriculture as in a strict definition through Pascoe's work and others, or not, I kind of leave open. But and also, actually, sorry, recognizing the diversity of Indigenous thinking and practices across the country. I think that's important as well.
Maybe help me get to the subtlety of that. So in some areas, we wouldn't recognize agricultural practices in a European context because they may. The question I was asking was, you were talking about different types of agricultural systems in different parts of Australia and recognize those differences. Maybe you could help us to understand what some of those different forms of agriculture look like.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, diversity across the landscape. So recognizing that there's over 260 different Indigenous groups across Australia, each who have their own history of colonization, but also probably have their own unique agricultural skill sets. Obviously, there's probably some of that that's shared, but quite often, I think, because of the landscape type and zones, I guess, within Australia, we know mob had different agricultural systems. For example, Uncle Bruce Pascoe talks about the native grain belt being kind of over that desert area and more inland area of New South Wales and WA. We know things like the Brewarra and the fish traps talk about aqua farming and the role in which that played in some areas. And even I think some of the early European observations of what was, on this landscape up through here, they talk about, mob being able to just dive down and catch lobsters the size of their fists, coming up from the ocean. And we know fishing and seafood was such an important role for mob on the coast. So just that nuance across all of Australia that is quite different. And when we talk about Indigenous ag, we kind of lump it all together, but I think respecting the broader view of that is important as well.
Yeah, amazing. And there was I think a subtle thing that you said around the focus at the moment is in the pre-colonial kind of agriculture. I might be wetting your powder here, but post-colonial agriculture holds so much more interest to you personally, or?
Personally, yeah. I think for me, obviously Indigenous agriculture, that pre-colonial phase is important, and the lessons and the native foods that come out of that are really rich, both from a sustenance point of view, but also from a cultural point of view. And I don't think we should ever lose that. I think there's a really important, delicate balance of thinking about those foods and how we kind of respect them in their own right. But equally, I think, and where I'm more focused, I guess, in my work is looking at the post-colonial involvement of Indigenous people on Western farms and throughout Western agriculture. So really recognizing that kind of post-colonization, there was this time and this period as kind of the frontier was built out by the Westerners, that Indigenous people actually pivoted and started working on these farms. They started bringing their Indigenous knowledge onto agricultural farms and stations and actually advising Western farmers about how to do their job a lot better than what they were doing. So there is this kind of real point of change, this fluidity of culture across not only Indigenous culture, but towards Western agriculture, and the way in which that played out and kind of existed really and still does today.
Can you, again, just help me understand in a visual picture, mental picture? So I can picture the Indigenous livestock people helping Western graziers understand, the rise and fall of creeks and where to put the cattle for various purposes, because they're inherently kind of familiar with the territory. What other things are you talking about, though? What's it like in this more modern industrial agricultural society rather than the grazing society of 1840s to present? The Kings of Grass Castles, I can see how they would have benefited from Indigenous knowledge, and Sydney Kidman is well reported to have. But yeah, the less pioneers and the more modern version, where are you seeing those Indigenous contributions today?
Yeah, so I think it's important that there are noted examples kind of from the early 1800s onwards, but none of that's really documented kind of from an Indigenous perspective. It's often white colonizers talking about, the Indigenous people helped us do X, Y, Z. And while that kind of gives a sense as to what happened, I'm sure that there's a lot of information missing within that complete narrative. Yeah. So we know across a whole heap of different landscapes that Indigenous people were really important in showing cattle producers and those who are moving cattle across the country as to where water would go, what areas to stay away from. And actually were really informative around where the livestock routes were within those early periods, that those connection points of water and where livestock should flow. So that was kind of a really obvious one. We know that Indigenous drovers often sang cattle to sleep at night. And I think that's a really interesting area that needs some more research around what role mob played in that, and kind of what was the importance of song and singing in language to cattle to calm them down. There is a little bit of literature out there, but probably not a lot. And really just as a workforce generally, we know that mob were out there working on farms, putting fences in and helping clear land and things like that. So this whole kind of range and suite of agricultural practices were really supported by Indigenous people across the country. Mm-hmm. Where we're at now, it is probably a well, there's a few different answers to this. The first is that I think when we look at the rest of the world, I would contend that our position in Australia is about 30 to 40 years behind that of the rest of the Western world. And I'd say that purely through a literal approach to this, in that the similar, what I think similar book is to Bruce Pascoe's in Australia, and probably more advanced in my interpretation of this book. But the similar book to that is by a guy called William Cronin, which was written in 1987. And, Pascoe's work doesn't come out until 2016, 17, I think. So, quite far behind that of the US. And really what you see over there, from what I can see from here, is a really sophisticated system that recognizes the fluidity of Indigenous culture towards Western agricultural systems, as well as recognizing the importance of native food. So you have this system over there that really protects Indigenous foods, in that Indigenous producers are able to get a trademark for their products, which provides them with a protection to say that it was Indigenous produced or grown. Yep. And at the same time, they can also use that trademark for if they're producing beef cattle, for instance. So there's that fluidity view of what Indigenous agriculture is in America. Yep. And that provides a lot of insights as to where I think Australia will head, hopefully soon.
It's Indigenous Ag as a brand exists in other parts of the world, but it hasn't caught on as in Australia. Is that pretty much?
Pretty much. I mean, and that more kind of broader view of what Indigenous Ag is, that it isn't just a static demeanor or a static view of what culture is. It recognizes that culture has adapted and moved over the last 200 years.
Yeah. Hopefully we're not having another problem with our internet here, Josh. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah, all good.
Yeah. I just want to make sure we captured that was the broader adaptation in the last 200 years. Years needs to be part of our current thinking.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, Josh, I guess where people have adopted Indigenous agriculture into more modern agricultural businesses, and that could be some of the experiences you had with organizations through PIC, or that could be clients of yours today or organizations you're involved with. Where are some of the great examples of modern Indigenous ag that we should be focused on it? The question I was hoping to bring us to were the innovative and exciting Indigenous agricultural businesses of today, and they can be ones you've worked with, your clients, the ones you're involved with. Love to hear about them.
Yeah. And I feel like I'm caveating everything, and maybe I should have continued my law degree, but I think it's important to first recognize, Wally, that there isn't a succinct view of Indigenous agriculture and the size and scale of that in Australia. And what I mean by that is that there is no survey other than ABS data that actually recognises Indigenous farmers across Australia, and that our research and development corporations don't ask whether a producer is Indigenous or not throughout their surveys. So for me, that's a huge gap within the current kind of environment, that there is a real lack of knowledge around the size and scale of Indigenous ag in its entirety. And why I think that happens is because of that fixed view of what Indigenous agriculture is that many people are prepared to look at Indigenous ag as just bush foods without appreciating the fact that there are Indigenous cattle producers or Indigenous sheep producers or Indigenous croppers in Australia. So that's where I think at some stage the industry will head down this route, that as organizations, as they currently are, there's a few that are doing it, are looking at doing reconciliation action plans. They're going to have to start asking their employees if they're Indigenous or not. And heaven forbid, there might be a few within there that actually identify. And when they do identify and they actually start looking at Indigenous agriculture in this kind of fluid sense, they're going to start realizing that there are some very large, big scale Indigenous producers out there.
Great insight. I mean, there's some inherent racist bullshit going on there, right? Because you get asked if you're Indigenous for education, for health, for most other government departments have got that as one of the first questions when applying for a grant or when dealing for a license. But agriculture is completely blind to that question.
Yeah, I think there's a real lack of maturity within the agricultural diversity field. It recognizes women in agriculture as kind of diverse, as a diverse cohort, but really fails to recognize, Indigenous and diverse cultures as being diverse within the agricultural sense, or just certainly hasn't really awoken to the fact that there are obviously other cultures within agriculture that make up this bigger sphere of what we know as agriculture now.
Yeah.
So once I think that maturity starts happening, once we start recognizing Indigenous people in agriculture, there is a lot of work to do. Obviously, some of the first bits of work is looking at reconciliation action plans and other commitments towards Indigenous people in the future. And there are some businesses who are doing that. So, for instance, like Bayer are starting to look at that now. We know that AACO have got a commitment to Indigenous people. So there is this kind of start of a conversation around this without making it too large. As of yet, GrainCorp's the other one, actually, which I think is really fascinating, that there's some Indigenous grain producers out there, and whether that's within native grains, but also within the common grain sphere. So I think there's some of those kind of practices that will start to happen. The other thing is that we do know that there is some research out there. So one of my supervisors for my research, Jim Prattley, has recently done some work that shows that there's probably only about 5 Indigenous ag graduates from any agricultural degree across all universities in Australia each year. And that's been a pretty static kind of number for at least the last 10 years. So there is this real lack of Indigenous ag graduates that are actually coming out across universities in Australia. And that's a huge gap and something that we need to address pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, there hasn't been a heck of a lot of ag degree graduates the last 2 years anyway.
No.
Yeah. So you might be familiar with the success of the Regen Ag course out of Southern Cross, which in its first few years of existence makes it the largest undergraduate degree that there is. So you're going into a small pool anyway. But yes. Point taken. And do we see the likes of Fairfax or Foundation for Rural and Regional Resilience, or the ARLP or the Nuffields, all these agricultural scholarship and education focused enterprises, are they open to the issues of Indigenous agriculture and education?
I think what we've probably seen across the university sphere is this kind of push in the early years, particularly, and certainly I think I felt as a university undergrad that there was this push that if you're Indigenous, you should go down the medicine or the legal route, and there's this real swelling of people that go down those kind of pathways. What we haven't necessarily seen is this push into a whole range of, or the broadening of other degrees that are out there, and really encouragement for people to follow their passion. So there is this kind of big opportunity for mob to go down, whether it's ag or environmental science, or even within the health degrees. There's a whole range of careers, obviously, that Indigenous people should do. We actually just need to encourage them to follow their dreams and their areas of interest. Yeah. And when that starts happening, I think what we'll see is a lot of those scholarship programs and those other programs out there that really pivot towards tailoring this whole other realm of scholarships and interest towards Indigenous people, where a lot of the scholarships really to date have been focused in that law or medicine space.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's fascinating. I think a real opportunity for regional philanthropy might be, or people that are looking to make an impact might be in that crossing over space. So, given the caveat around,
I
would love to jump into some of the most exciting and innovative Indigenous ag businesses that you're coming across at the moment.
Yeah. So I think if I take that broader view of Indigenous ag, one of the examples that always stands out to me, one of the biggest businesses that I think we need to really start promoting more is the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation. As an entity, they're one of the biggest cattle producers in Australia. They also have a sheep property down in Tasmania, and their whole business purpose is really to purchase freehold land and convert that back to freehold land back to Indigenous parties. So they kind of buy it within with a sense, I guess, in partnership with Indigenous people, with a view to hold and hand that back to them at some stage once the business is mature. For me, that's a huge opportunity for us to showcase the size and scale of Indigenous ag in that kind of broader view, because they are one of the biggest cattle producers in Australia, and there's a lot to learn from their story.
How big are they? Can you share any kind of insight for those that are not familiar with them?
I think anecdotally, like I've heard within the top 5, top 10 cattle producers in Australia. So, a serious enough player that we should actually start having research done within Indigenous agriculture, as within, Indigenous pastoral stations and things like that.
Yeah.
I think the other area that's really of interest when you actually start digging into some of these areas is if you do a search for Aboriginal cattle producers, for instance, on Google, and often that's ABC stories actually that really tell the tale and that size and scale. So it's not uncommon to pull out numbers like 40,000 head of cattle here, and quite large holdings in terms of land size as well. So there is a lot of kind of big, what should be considered big players within the space. We just need to do, obviously, a lot more work of actually allowing them to self-identify as Indigenous businesses so that we can better tailor to their needs where they're different, or to actually work with them to identify research agendas that might be uniquely Indigenous based on their practices as well. So all that being said, I think that there are some really good Indigenous businesses within the bush food space as well. It's important to identify that there is a real lack of representation of Indigenous people within the bush food space. So only about 1 or 2% of the revenue that's involved in bush foods actually goes to Indigenous businesses.
Wow, so that's shocking. So the commercialization, say, of the Kakadu plum or the other bush foods, only 1 or 2% of that's reaching the mob from where that fruit's grown, or
well, the revenue in general. So there's 6,500 different types of bush foods in Australia. So there's quite a lot. There are, about 13 to 20 that have been commercialized within what the agricultural industry would count as commercialized. And that's, FSAN's registered and, have kind of been around for a while. So most of those that have been commercialized, a lot of the revenue, as I said, 98 to 99% of the revenue actually goes back to a non-Indigenous producer or non-Indigenous value adder.
Wow. I mean, that's horrible.
Yeah. So it's interesting in the sense that when we consider what Indigenous agriculture is, and most of society say, oh, okay, it's just bush foods. You can, there's this kind of sense I feel as a producer that when you say you're an Indigenous farmer, they say, oh, okay, you farm bush foods. And it's this kind of view, I guess, that, oh, you can, like, of course, Aboriginal people can have bush foods, like that's yours, and we won't interfere. But actually what's happening is, and what's happened historically is that non-Indigenous people have commercialized these industries and have basically taken the monopoly or a duopoly approach over it, securing the whole supply chain and therefore getting all the value that's within the industry.
Wow. I mean, if you'd have told me that only 1 or 2% of current conventional agriculture flowed back to Indigenous organisations, I would have said that's, a shame and we need to fix it. But to say that within bush foods, which is so in the stereotype of, well, they're natively owned, grown, and organisations that are owned by mob, growing food, retailing it for themselves, keeping most of the money for themselves. But you're saying of those 15 to 20 commercialised, that's just not the case. Yeah.
Yeah, it's nowhere near the case. And I mean, there are a few really big examples that really demonstrate that. So, for instance, macadamias, for instance, kind of anecdotally, I was asked a question even last week just of, do you know any Indigenous macadamia growers out there? It's a bush food that obviously got commercialized in Hawaii after plants got taken from Australia. But, there isn't really any Indigenous representation within the macadamia industry. We know in terms of lemon myrtle, the largest producer is a white company now. It was really pioneered by a white guy in Australia who led and took over the industry, started growing it en masse, and has had the sole kind of view of the monopolistic view of the market ever since then. So these are industries that really need a lot of work, and they also just really need a lot of work around recognizing Indigenous people as the first growers of these products.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That was great, because it was both examples of where Indigenous are having success and where they're actually not getting recognised the way that we think that they are or should be in home markets. Let's talk about, I guess, the domain of the stereotypical stale male pale kind of farmer. Outside of grazing cattle, the cropping sector, you mentioned that there are a few quite large Indigenous bulk commodity croppers. Have you got some examples of farms that you're seeing? And I ask this a bit knowing that you've got some great photos of silos around New South Wales, which suggests to me that you went on a bit of a tour last year. Yeah.
The tour was for something else, actually, but what we do know is that there are Indigenous people out there cropping kind of conventional cropping, or what people would recognise as just kind of in broader engagement within the grain industry. I don't have any public examples, and the reason why I think it's important for Indigenous businesses to self-identify, but there are Indigenous businesses who are involved in these enterprises, who have certainly reached out to me, and we've had discussion around what does this representation look like, and how might they be able to identify in the future. So there's certainly businesses out there who are already doing it, who already are farming in this kind of conventional sense. That would be common to anyone within the agricultural industry, who are just waiting for that opportunity to identify, and just haven't been asked the question quite often. That they just haven't been asked, are you an Indigenous business? And that's why I think it's so important for the research and development corporations to really ask that question, so that we can get that size and scale of Indigenous agriculture in Australia. We do know, within a kind of bush food sense, that there are quite a lot of mob now engaged in native grains, and the work that Black Duck Foods is doing in this space is really important around trying to actually grow a native grain economy across Australia, and really connecting and educating and showcasing what's possible within this space. So I do know that they're doing some work at the moment, with some agricultural companies and some research companies, to really try and look at the size and scale of it, and what some of the potential opportunities might exist there. And I think that's going to be really powerful, just to showcase what can be done within this industry going forward.
Yeah. Now I'm noticing a lot of interest in bush food grains, particularly like kangaroo grass and things that. And speaking to the likes of Rob Pekin, who's really inspired by some mob down at the Murray, and has brought even some mob into their Brisbane, and are now flour milling bush grasses and selling direct to consumers in Brisbane. Alternative grained, Indigenous grown flour. Is this the craft beer of the flour movement? Is this the start of something bigger, or is this going to stay as a niche market?
I think it's interesting, because we haven't really had a industry-wide perspective on where bush foods should go. There's this kind of very varied view, and this is Indigenous and non-Indigenous producers, who kind of can obviously see the opportunities that exist within bush foods, and know that there's a market there, and know that there's a lot of potential, but there isn't kind of a fixed viewpoint, I guess, within the broader industry as to where bush foods might go, and whether they become that niche product, or whether they really go down that pathway of being quite a common product that anyone can kind of access, and you get the most of the value, I guess, really through bulk size. So I think that's an interesting question. There is a lot of conversation that's also got to happen around that. For instance, do you start selecting bush foods that are known for growing to a bigger grain size, for instance, or are we happy to have quite a blended grain size that we use? And do we use that for bread, or do we use it for other high value products? Even the farming practices that sit behind native grains is very interesting. So do we allow for some GMO, genetically modified properties within these plants to make sure that they grow en masse, so that we can get the scale of it? Or do we make sure that they're protected as a native product, and that we protect the true integrity of that? Is it cultural practice to only select small grain sizes, so that the bigger grains can go back into the ground and produce a bigger product for the next season? All these kind of questions really need to emerge out of the industry, and I think we're at such an early stage within bush foods, and so much of it has been taken from mob, that there's got to be a lot of work very quickly to start catching up and really asking some of these big, broader questions that a lot of people within the industry aren't thinking of yet.
Yeah. Josh, fascinating. Can we move sort of parallel to agriculture for a second? And I'd like to talk about the environmental markets and Indigenous agriculture. So for some of our kind of listeners through the Regen Farmers Mutual, they'll be interested in the cultural co-benefits and additional income that Indigenous practices and Indigenous landholders may be entitled to. Yep. So I wondered if we could talk to your familiarity, your knowledge around the Indigenous environmental markets and their crossover with agriculture.
Cool. So back to my good old legal days. I think it's important to recognise first that the size and scale of Indigenous land holdings in Australia as well. So between 40 to 60% of Australia's landmass is owned by Indigenous people. And it's quite a large scale because of a few reasons. Obviously, native title is one of the main ones. And just because you have ownership of land doesn't mean you have, free access to it. There's a whole range of kind of issues with that. And it also doesn't really take into account Aboriginal freehold. And nor will it, because we don't know the size and scale of Indigenous agriculture to basically understand how much land mob has out there farming. So it is kind of a big view. But essentially, even if we stuck with half, what that represents to me is a huge potential for not only agriculture, but other land-based opportunities for mob right across the country.
Yeah.
Where I think the industry has kind of been at to date is really around looking at kind of the generic carbon markets that have provided opportunity for mob in the past, and I think it's been really interesting. I think from my perspective to see that play out. There's some really good projects being done by Aboriginal Carbon Foundation and 5-6 Alliance within that space. And they're, through their work, are now starting to look at the co-benefits that might exist within that space. Where I think I'm most interested is how we can really build Indigenous markets and the Indigenous narrative across these benefits or across these markets to ensure that there is more revenue flowing back to Indigenous groups. And I even mean that in a selfish way, that I think that there should be more profit, more revenue given to Indigenous groups for the same credits, where they've got a cultural connection to the land, where they can show there's other additional benefits from their activities. So the example I always use for this is Qantas, actually. And Qantas is a big player who have bought carbon credits for a long period of time, where the average person who wants to offset their carbon emissions when you can fly can go on and tick the box, and they pay a kind of a fixed rate. When they buy the carbon credits from people, obviously there's a range of projects, and what I see as a consumer is that there's kind of a real mix of projects, but there's no difference between a project where people plant trees on their property, which is certainly a good project, but there's no difference between that and an Indigenous group up in NT, for instance, who are using their cultural knowledge on their land, who are training up the next generation and sharing cultural knowledge with young kids as to how to look after that land. There is no difference in the amount of money that you pay between those two credits. And I think for me, that's a huge opportunity for Aboriginal carbon markets generally, because that story has to be worth something. It's very easy for Indigenous people to just go out and not clear some land and get the carbon credits from that, or go through and plant a whole heap of trees. They're kind of vanilla kind of projects, if I'd say. But where organizations and as I say, Qantas is an example of this, where they want to tell the narrative of Indigenous people looking after their land, where they want to take that story and really interweave that with their branding, that has to be worth something. And it has to be worth a premium price on top of the current price that Indigenous groups are receiving. So that's where I would really hope the market will get to soon. I think it's important that premium starts getting recognized earlier rather than later, because there is a lot of cultural knowledge. There is a lot of that cross contamination of that ability for mob to really sit down and really share across generations around what caring for this country looks like, and how we do that together is really important. And as I said, there's so many beautiful stories out there already. I think they're worth something. I think it's worth more than the farmer somewhere who decides to just plant a whole heap of trees.
I think that is so true. So if I can repeat back to you what I thought I understood about the Aboriginal Carbon Fund, was that it was maybe able to get a premium in market because it was recognised as carbon with a narrative. And the other thing that I believe is unique to the Aboriginal Carbon Fund is that it's Aboriginals who own the equity piece, and it's going back to mob. There's no white fella dilution in that. I think that's a really good and important part of the story to yeah. I was under the impression also, at least maybe this is only in Queensland, the LRF recognises cultural co-benefits and will pay an additional fee for carbon sequestered and projects planned through the LRF, but that might not be the case in WA and NT, is it?
Not to my knowledge, and certainly not under the general carbon market that you sell to from the federal government. That certainly doesn't recognise that at all.
Yeah, no, well, the ERF, the government definitely doesn't. It's follow the bouncing ball, get rewarded with your accus, and we'll buy 96% of them. So, yeah. Look, that's huge. I guess the questions on, as we're now starting to see biodiversity markets come up with the introduction of the biodiversity bill by David Littleproud last week. And there's some concerns there that Indigenous landholders might be excluded from this because it's going to be under the criteria of the same criteria. Well, there's some confusion around the criteria, but it's currently called private land. Native title might not easily fit into that, which might exclude a number of Indigenous organisations from the emerging voluntary biodiversity market. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think even within the private market, and Indigenous land ownership kind of generally that's owned by Indigenous groups, whether that's freehold or not, I think there are kind of bigger conversations that have to happen around that. So, for instance, if I'm really transparent, the amount of land that our land council, the land council that I'm a member of, holds within our area, up until recently, we had no idea about how big that estate was or where all those parcels of land were. And there are so many unresolved land claims across New South Wales that really we just don't know how much land we'll end up with or kind of how that works. And there is a bit of literature out there that really says that this whole process of handing land back to Indigenous groups actually disempowers Indigenous people, because what it does is, where you and I might be able to have free reign over our own home and the decisions we make here, it's really hard for groups, membership groups, to make big decisions over these blocks of land that they might not have any idea on where they are, or what the size of them is, or how it's been used, or a whole range of other questions that kind of co-sit with that. So that whole ability around joint ownership actually disempowers a lot of Indigenous people across Australia. And I think there's a lot of work to be done within that. But I think, obviously, if with that large land holding, 40 to 60% of Australia's land mass, there has to really be opportunities for Indigenous people to participate in any market. And the kind of ownership structure that sits there, really needs to be considered when passing some of these bills. There's a huge, I think, disservice that we kind of look at Indigenous land holdings. We didn't have these kind of systems 200 years ago. We just looked after the land and knew where our boundaries were and did our own thing. And we kind of the colonizers kind of self-imposed this kind of view as what land ownership is. And, we've now had to kind of fit within it. So there really needs to be that kind of broader consideration. And obviously with that large land holding, we just need to work with mob around some of these projects.
I guess some of the 40% to 60% of the land mass, when government's having a discussion about reaching net zero, but not including Indigenous agriculture, how's that a genuine conversation?
I don't know how we have any conversations in Australia about agriculture generally without having Indigenous people. We know of that 40 to 60% of land mass, more and more of that will be relied upon to keep feeding our population here and exporting food overseas. We know that relationships between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous farmers aren't the greatest across the country, and that there's a lot of work to be done. But when we get to the federal and even state agricultural departments and have these conversations, we often disclude Indigenous voices. It really fascinates me that we don't have the ability to recognise that such a large land holding, such a rich history, that Indigenous people need to be front and centre of that and really have a voice at the table, which is what's happened in the US, that their Indigenous agricultural organisations, the organisations that are there to protect the rights and interests of Indigenous farmers across the states, have a seat that they directly report to the US Department of Agriculture. They have a secretary who sits on the top of their board and feeds straight into government every day. We're really missing that kind of step here, and it's so important because of that large land ownership. But it's also important because of the, all the issues that we've identified over the last few pages, and just that size and scale. We're just so far behind from these conversations that I think it's really hard often, I think, to see that headway that needs to be made.
Mate, that is solid gold. I'm going to get us to pull up because we're coming on to the hour. But I did want to say, Josh, we got there in the end. It is horrifying to think that the US has the built-in infrastructure for Indigenous farmers to get premiums and to, share their wisdom and understanding with the top of the ag industry. And yet we can't even get our government departments to ask whether the farmer's Indigenous origin and take stock of how much land is in a native title group. So we've got a long way to go with Indigenous agriculture and our position here in Australia. But I wanted to thank you for your time, for educating me and hopefully a few of the other people listening today about Indigenous agriculture. So thanks, Josh.
No, thanks, mate. And yeah, there's a whole heap of other rabbit warrens to go down at some future stage around that. I think that there is a lot of opportunity that comes with including Indigenous people, and that's got to be done by not only agriculture at large, but also all the ancillary organisations that sit around it, particularly the banking industry. So I think there's a lot of ground to be made at some stage.
Yeah. Josh, look forward to that next conversation. Cheers,
Sounds
mate.
good. Thanks, mate.